Brilliant. Well, let us kick off. Thank you so much for being with us. Um, just to maybe kick us off, wanted to get started with a couple of introductions. Caroline, I think we still have your screen, so maybe if you could just move over to the next page. Just to start us off, so I'm Saif. Anyone who's been following our podcasts will probably be sick of my voice by now. But for those that don't know me, I'm happy to give a quick introduction. So I was born and grew up in Pakistan. Most of you will be familiar with Pakistan in some shape or form. Ways good, ways not so good. But you might also know that it's one of the dark red spots on the climate risk maps that you see, which means it's one of the countries most at risk from climate change. I started off as an environmental activist, and so I was trying to change behaviors, hearts and minds, and the way that my community thought about the environment. I had very little success with that, and so I eventually tried to change the government and became a political activist when I was around 19 or 20, and there was a military government in Pakistan. That was a little more successful, although I was a very small part in a much larger movement. We helped bring down the military government and usher in a new era of democracy. Sadly, a somewhat short-lived era of democracy, but that's a story for another time. I then started another movement trying to pick up waste off the streets because I thought in this new democratic era, we should be able to change hearts and minds more effectively. The government actually then offered me a job and said, hey, you're busy trying to motivate people from the outside. Why don't you do it from inside the system and join the government and try and drive change with us? So I joined the government in Pakistan, did 3 years with them, setting up new infrastructure projects for waste management, transport, hydropower, agriculture, and the like. And I actually found that I was a small cog in a big machine, and very often a cog whirring by itself busily. And a lot of the stuff that I worked on wasn't actually getting through to implementation, wasn't actually having success. And so I thought, well, maybe the best way to do this is to try and start a venture of my own and maybe start a business focused on helping environmental challenges. I didn't know how to start a business, so I joined McKinsey because I thought that's the best way, the best shortcut. I thought I'm going to spend 2 or 3 years at McKinsey, exit, and start a business focused on social challenges. Flash forward 6, 7, 8 years, and I was still at McKinsey, now a leader in the sustainability practice based out of London, but still hankering after having some real world impact because the slide making wasn't enough for me. So I started a farming business supplying flowers and fragrance extracts and derivatives into cosmetics companies and personal care companies like Lush, which some of you might know. My customers started asking me for better data, and this was my side hustle, so I didn't have any data to give them, but they were asking me for product level carbon footprints effectively, LCAs, anything that I might have that could approximate the environmental impact of the products that I was selling them. I actually thought that's a really interesting challenge to solve, and I can see how solving this challenge would help mobilize more climate action and more value chain collaboration. And so I thought, let me leave McKinsey, move on from my farming business, and start a company focused really on the sustainability data side of things. And so I am happy to have founded Altruistic almost 4 years ago now. I'm joined here at this webinar by Caroline. I'll let Caroline introduce herself. Caroline, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Seb. Thanks for the intro, and welcome everyone, and great to be with you this afternoon. I'm Caroline. I'm a product manager at Altruistic, and I lead specifically on our product carbon footprint module. I've been at Altruistic for the past 2.5 years and spent 2 of those thinking exclusively about our product carbon footprint offering. Prior to Altruistic, then I spent the first decade of my career working in a number of different early stage tech startups and sustainability focused startups until Seth convinced me to join the bandwagon and build out his vision for Altruistic.
And very happy I did. Caroline and I are tag teaming on this webinar, which means that one of us, Caroline, is holding the master on the deck. And so we're going to play this fun game where I try and tee up cues for Caroline. Caroline has to guess when I'm indicating the next slide. And so, well done, Caroline, on the first one. Altruistic, just to recalibrate and reintroduce our company as well. Altruistic is a software company. We have 3 products. One is corporate footprinting, which is everything to do with greenhouse gas inventory, carbon baselining, etc., where our software delivers a dynamic carbon inventory capability, whether it's around the data gathering, transformation, calculation, scenario modeling, target setting, all of that fun stuff. The second product that we have is our product footprinting capability. We're going to talk a bit more about that today during this webinar, so I won't wax lyrical about that now. And then our third product is our supply chain engagement product, which is extensively focused on enabling and facilitating collaboration across the value chain, be it focused on data or on change itself. And we work very closely, usually with procurement teams, on driving that forward. And so if I kind of maybe start off a little with just the agenda for, well done again, Caroline. If I start off with just the agenda for today, we're going to just start off with just a bit of context around why carbon baselines aren't the real narrative for the sustainability journey. And I realize that's a bit of a provocative statement, but we'll come back to it. We're then going to go through a checklist for how to build a useful product carbon footprint, and we'll go through collecting primary data, calculation, verification and audit, and communication. And we're then going to have hopefully at least 10 minutes or so for Q&A. For those who've joined us on some of these webinars before, Caroline, too fast. For those who've joined us on some of these webinars before, we usually try and run through the content without interruption, just so that we have just a consistent flow. And then we have the Q&A right at the end. If there's any questions that come to mind that you want to make sure you don't forget, please just pop them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end in time. And so now, if we just maybe go back to why carbon baselines aren't the real narrative, we sort of liken this a little to Game of Thrones, where for anyone who's read the Game of Thrones books or watched the TV series Second Best, you spend the first half of the show thinking that the plot is actually about court intrigue and dynastic politics, and that's the real star attraction. Whereas actually in the second half, what you start to realize is the real enemy is the White Walkers sitting beyond the wall, basically. And in the same way, we find that most of the industry has been attuned to thinking about carbon baselines as the real focus, the be-all and end-all of sustainability data. Whereas the plot twist here is we actually find product carbon footprints much more useful, and much more useful actually in driving change. And we're going to talk a bit about why that's the case. And so, Karen, if we kind of move over a couple of slides on, the reason why we find carbon baselines aren't the real narrative here is firstly because they tend to have less success resonating with customers. This is true whether you're a B2B organization or if you're a B2C organization. If you're a consumer-facing organization, the data tells us that most consumers aren't really able to distinguish the emissions footprint of your product. They don't really have context for it. And so the companies that tend to do best or see the best results by putting a carbon label on the product fall into either of two camps, and there's some overlap here. One is they're putting labels on the product, and that signals to their consumer that they are a more ethical company, and they see a general sort of uplift that is consistent with any form of labeling. Let me say that a different way. There is good data out there that tells us that you will benefit from some sort of an uplift, whether it's that more consumers are picking your product in preference to alternatives or paying a little bit more. You'll benefit from the same sort of uplift, regardless of what the label is, what the claim is that you put on. The very fact that you have some sort of a label or some sort of a claim is a signaling mechanism to your consumer. It doesn't matter whether the emissions number you're putting is 0.25 or 0.06 or whatever it might be. And so that's kind of one category where you tend to see some benefits as a consumer-facing business. The other category where you see some benefits is if you're a challenger brand, and we'll come back to this a bit later. You're a challenger brand, and your product is inherently more sustainable than the alternative, and the alternative is more or less everyone else in the industry. But with the exception of those two categories, getting a carbon emissions number to resonate, if you think of it as a corporate number to resonate with your customer, tends to be a very hard exercise to go through. As a B2B company, it's also quite difficult to get this to resonate with your customer. So if you're an ingredient supplier or a material supplier sharing data with your customers, increasingly your customer wants to know what is the share of emissions associated with me. If I'm buying packaging from an Amcor or an Avery Dennison, I want to know what is the share of emissions associated with the stock keeping units or the products that I'm buying, not really what the emissions footprint is of the entire business. The business may actually be many times larger than me. The business may be serving 100 times more supply than I'm buying. And so actually the overall number is not so relevant for me. What I really want to know is the numbers of the products that I'm buying. The second reason why carbon baselines really are struggling to dominate the narrative in terms of how they drive decarbonization is because they obscure supply chain opportunities within the arcana of carbon accounting. If you think of scope 1, 2, 3, scope 3 is this sort of giant other bucket, basically, where it's 95, 97, in some cases 99% of the carbon baseline. And within that, you have all these subcategories. And within one of those categories, you'll have like purchase goods and services. And within that, you might have many of the actual opportunities that are most synergistic with your brand and that are most easy for you to access and drive within your supply chain. But they'll be mixed in with all kinds of other activities and categories that you're not really able to drive. And so there's this obscuring of the actual interesting content behind carbon accounting and behind the carbon baseline. The third is that operational action becomes quite difficult. This goes back again to communication, but now we're looking internally within your organization. As you're trying to radiate change outside the core sustainability team, and you're trying to get the logistics teams involved and the operations teams and your procurement colleagues involved, you need some universal language through which you can communicate. You need to make sure you're able to actually communicate with them effectively around interventions without having to go through this massive re-education journey. And the problem with carbon baselines is because they're so closely associated with the greenhouse gas protocol and carbon accounting, you sort of have to run this education process around what scope 1, 2, and 3 is, why this kind of makes sense, why it doesn't make sense, and go through this whole explanation and re-educate any colleague that you want to engage with. Whereas orienting around product carbon footprints, and we'll talk more about this momentarily, takes the lens of the product. And the product is a very powerful unifying language within any product company, because any company producing a product is oriented already towards optimizing that product. They're trying to make sure that the product is made to high quality, made on time, made at the right volume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you communicate in that language and you say, look, we are sourcing wheat or soy for this product, we need to source a different kind of wheat or soy because we've been used to looking at certain quality indicators. Now we have an additional indicator we're looking at when we're procuring wheat or soy. That's a much easier conversation to have than to first go through the whole arcana of scope 1, 2, 3 carbon accounting. And so we find that product carbon footprints really sidestep these three challenges that you see yourself faced with in the greenhouse gas accounting world. If we maybe move on to a little of how this can really help focus efforts. When you look at your opportunities through the product carbon footprint lens, you start to see not just the different ingredients going into it, but also the suppliers from which you're sourcing each of those ingredients. And ideally, you're already starting to acquire product carbon footprints from your suppliers for those ingredients, which means that you get instant comparability at the level of the individual ingredient. Internally, if you're actually generating product carbon footprint snapshots for a product made at facility A versus facility B, you also get instant comparability between those two as well. And you abstract away all of the operational setup factors that could skew a greenhouse gas inventory comparison. You also make communication much more straightforward in the ways that we've described. We're actually seeing anecdotally in our own practice, in the use of our own software, we're seeing product carbon footprint use. And by use, I mean the generation of product carbon footprints within the platform, but also the acquisition of product carbon footprints from suppliers of our customers. We're seeing both these numbers uptick pretty rapidly. And so the chart you see here is from our internal analytics. And you can see that over the last 4 months or so alone, you have almost a 3x uplift in product carbon footprint generation and acquisition by our customers. This is in line with what we see the market outside altruistic doing as well. We see more and more requests for proposals coming from large businesses looking for support on generating their own product carbon footprint capability. And we see this as a direct response to large brands. And Caroline will talk shortly about the PACT coalition and framework. We're seeing this as also a direct response to the momentum that coalition is generating as well. And so this is a current topic. It's a topic that most companies are setting in place capabilities this year, and we expect this to start hitting the market at large next year and going forward. Maybe just before passing over to Caroline, we're going to also we're running a short survey. It's basically just one question. You can scan the QR code. You'll get taken to Menti, which is an app that will receive your your answer to this one question, and we'll try and showcase some of the responses if we get sufficient density, and we'll also try and address some of the challenges that you might highlight as well. But I'm just going to pause for 10 seconds so that anyone who is so inclined can scan this QR code and share with us the biggest challenge they face when developing a product carbon footprint. It is fine to say your biggest challenge is you don't know what a product carbon footprint is. It's also fine to say you've been asked for one, but you've no idea how to get one. All challenges are welcome here. We do not discriminate between challenges, so please feel free to scan and enter your challenge of choice. And we'll also put the QR code in the chat so that you can have it accessible as well as we go forward. With that, Caroline, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through our checklist.
Cool, thanks a lot, Saif. And maybe this next section will give you some inspiration about your challenges if something is not popping to mind. So Saif has set the scene and spoken a bit about how product carbon footprints as a kind of unit of data exchange are really taking off, primarily because they're super useful for both making kind of informed decarbonisation decisions within your organisation, and also because they're much more helpful when communicating sustainability data outwards onto customers. I am going to cover a checklist for some elements that we're thinking about at Altruistic for how to build a genuinely useful product carbon footprint. And this is going to cover primary data collection, actually making the product carbon footprint calculation and kind of standardizing that approach and the exchange of the data, verifying and auditing product carbon footprints down the supply chain, and then communicating, we've used the word here, wisely, how you choose to share that data. So 4 meaty topics. Let's get started with the first one, primary data collection. Now, typically, if you're calculating a product carbon footprint, especially in the food and beverage industry, then you're going to start by using secondary data or secondary EFs to represent parts of that product carbon footprint. And if we're working towards actually useful product carbon footprints that truly represent your business and your supply chain, then a necessary move is towards primary data collection, so you have an accurate view of what's going on in your organization with your products. When we say this, then sometimes people can begin to freak out because they're thinking, gosh, I have hundreds, thousands of suppliers. How on earth am I going to go out to all of my suppliers and expect them to calculate product footprints and share them with me and incorporate them? And our answer to this is we don't need to start by doing everything all in one go. We can take sensible kind of steps towards increasing the amount of primary data that we're collecting, starting off where it's 1, most material, and 2, most accessible. So we might, for example, cohort suppliers, let's say look at all suppliers and take into account which suppliers are contributing inputs and ingredients that we know are high emitting, and then segment those, say, into our top 30 suppliers who we expect to be our kind of high emitting suppliers, start with those. And then perhaps within that category, further segment again and think about, okay, are there already some suppliers within that group that are more data mature, more sustainability mature, they're more likely to provide data at the product level that we can actually use and trust. And then that's the kind of subset to work with first. Show how this can work in practice, start getting the data flowing in, upgrading your secondary data to primary data in these core places, and then build out from there. So really the message and the takeaway is, yes, primary data is really critical. No, we don't need to get to primary data all at once. We can take it piece by starting in the places where it's easiest and where it matters most. The other part of primary data collection, especially from the supply chain that Saif has already covered a bit, is when we started at Altruistic, we started focusing on collecting supplier corporate GHG baseline data, and quickly found that this is just not granular enough. to actually be useful in then making business decisions, especially, thinking about research and development, trying to redesign products, that full corporate baseline from the supplier just doesn't cut it. So we've really seen a shift in the past 12 months from kind of starting here towards when we are collecting this data now, the real need and the real focus is on product footprints. Our second point in the checklist is how do we actually think about kind of calculating and standardizing product footprint data. This is probably one of the topics that I spend longest thinking about, and in some ways causes the most headaches, because in the world of corporate footprinting, then we have, for its pros and cons, a set standard, the greenhouse gas protocol that everyone is aligned around, and we've all agreed on how to calculate organization level footprints. When it comes to calculating product carbon footprints, it's still a little bit more nascent, and we do not have that full industry alignment on exactly how we're going to create them. So what we're seeing is a proliferation of methodologies. We have ISO standards, we have the PEF standard in Europe, we have PACT, numerous other product labeling companies trying to create their new one standard to rule them all. And this can make it a bit confusing to know which standard and method should I follow. Each one has a different level of specificity and inclusion, and where do we get started? The other part of this is you might be thinking, well, I'm an organization with a huge number of SKUs, and how do I actually calculate product carbon footprints across my portfolio at scale, especially when there's this kind of like murkiness on method and what should be included, sometimes even different methods within different product categories. And one of the answers we believe at Altruistic, and this is not a silver bullet solution, but this is an organization that we feel is really thinking about this in a pragmatic, very pragmatic way, is PACT, which you may or may not have heard of. If you haven't, I'll just introduce them. So PACT, it stands for the Partnership for Carbon Transparency. They are spun out of the WBCSD, so the organization that developed the GHG protocol, with a kind of track record in creating a standard that can be adopted by the mass. And their key kind of vision and tenet is that to really make movement on decarbonisation, we need to understand what is happening in the supply chain. And to do that, we need granular, accurate, trustworthy data at the product level. And they believe, and we're aligned to this, that this is the missing gap right now that is preventing real action, especially around decarbonisation through supply chains. PACT think about two things specifically that help solve some of these dragons that were listed here around calculation, and that is they set a specific standard and method for how to calculate product carbon footprints, which is robust, but not too elaborate that it's difficult to follow, a really kind of sensible starting point for getting everyone calculating product footprints in the same way, which is already an amazing start. And then in addition to that, they also think about how that data is shared. Today, if you have experience sharing product carbon footprints, then maybe it's through Excel sheets and ad hoc emails where there's a request and some maybe kind of LCA that's attached with a PDF with some context around it. And that's not going to work if this is a really kind of serious data point that is used for decision making. So PACT also define a specific data model and data standard and mechanism for how companies can share that data that is consistent and fully interoperable between solutions. So with those two things, a kind of standardized kind of pragmatic method and a data sharing standard, then we're seeing a lot of people gravitate towards PACT and the work that they're doing, including the CPG companies listed on this slide. Just to go into a bit more detail again on how this would work and how product level data sharing can work down the supply chain. Let's imagine a kind of tier 0 company, so a supermarket. creating their own product carbon footprints, perhaps with a view at some point of putting those product carbon footprints on consumer products. They will then need to go back a step to the inputs that go into their products from their tier one suppliers and collect product carbon footprints that have been calculated at this level, and then back again, and so on down the supply chain, where at each level we're calculating a product carbon footprint with a standard methodology, passing it on to the next tier in the supply chain, so we can build those product carbon footprints up into final product emissions, ideally based on primary data that fully reflects what's actually happening in that supply chain. One of the questions that you might have with all of this that we hear very frequently is, yes, this sounds great, a kind of standard method for calculating PCFs and a standard way of exchanging PCFs sounds really cool, but we're not there yet, and our suppliers are definitely not there yet. How do we make some progress even in light of not being able to get to this kind of vision today? Should we just do nothing until we're all aligned on the same standard? To that, then we would say no. We don't think that any action should be stifled in this space. We really think, any organization trying to get to kind of trustworthy representative data of their product should be commended and used. And if we have like a robust data quality scoring system, then this can help us understand, even for imperfect data that is not, fully aligned to the standards yet, to what extent that data point is, by collecting a number of fairly easy to collect metrics about the data coming in. And then based on that data quality score, we know how reliable the data is that we're receiving and how much weight we can put on that when we're using that received PCF in our own product carbon footprints. Alongside collecting the data quality score, we can also collect the primary data share, so we know how much of that data that's in the PCF that I'm receiving comes from primary data sources versus secondary sources, which again is just another indicator to say, for that PCF, based on what I'm receiving, how much can I trust that today as we work to the common standard and method across the industry. Okay, next one, another juicy one. Verifying and auditing PCFs. A word that I've used a lot so far is how can we get to trustworthy data through the supply chain? And obviously this is really key. There's no point replacing out secondary emissions factors for supplier provided emissions factors if we can't trust that that data quality is better and actually representative of the practices happening in that supply chain. Sort of like collecting primary data, this feels like a maybe kind of hard and intractable problem. But again, we can break it down and think about where does it really make sense to audit PCFs today and where is it valuable to do so? So a number of use cases listed on this slide. First two say, if we're thinking about using that PCF internally, again, making a product design decision, switching out one ingredient for another ingredient. In some cases, maybe it's less important to have a fully audited PCF. A PCF from your supplier is going to give you some, positive directional view of, how you can make a change that has some impact. And you might be able to trust that enough to do what you need to do to make that business decision. Likewise, if we're sharing PCFs through the supply chain, perhaps through lower tiers, aligning right now around like the PACT standard and reporting on data quality and primary data share already shows a high willingness to kind of engage in data quality and thinking about data. And perhaps that is trustworthy enough for what you want to do with that PCF right now. Where we would advise verification and auditing already today, whilst at some point the industry is going to mature and we're going to get to verified and audited PCFs across the supply chain, but we're just talking about how to get started with this today. The place where we think it's really important to do this, no matter what, and to really invest is if you want to put consumer-facing labels on end consumer products. These could come under a lot of scrutiny. I don't need to talk about greenwashing and a number of companies that get called out for misleading customers in some way. So we would really recommend that, if you're putting consumer labels on your products, especially if you're in a kind of slightly more contentious space, then it is worthwhile doing the kind of auditing and verification of the data that's being used in the PCF at that level. Which brings us on to the final element in how to think about creating an actually useful PCF, which is how to communicate and use that information. So again, we're splitting this up into, are you sharing that PCF down the supply chain to other businesses, or are you going to be sharing that information outwards to consumers? When thinking about communicating to consumers, then we make a distinction between kind of incumbent brands that have had a long foothold in an industry, have very kind of popular products that have been sold for a long time, versus new challenger brands that are incoming with a new product offering. We think that today there's probably very little impetus for a kind of incumbent brand to start communicating product carbon footprints. It's not necessarily part of the brand story so far, and trying to differentiate on a product carbon footprint today is probably not going to lead to very much kind of competitive advantage. But where we're seeing brands be successful with putting kind of product labels or similar onto their products is a challenger brand. So something like Oatly, for example, which has a radically different alternative to a dairy product, significantly lower in emissions, typically, and can create like a strong story around putting that label onto the product. So that's one distinction that we're thinking through with companies that we work with. On the other side, on the B2B sharing, this is normally more for thinking about decarbonisation opportunities. So if you're thinking maybe about investing in your supply chain and working with your supply chain to decarbonise, again, we need the primary product level data to have enough granularity in the data to drive those decisions. So communicating through the supply chain so you can start looking at these opportunities together is how we're thinking about things on the B2B side. Sorry, that was a little preview of the next slide. Skip too soon. Cool, so that is our 4-point checklist. I'm now going to jump to the altruistic platform and show you some of this in action, so we can bring a bit of life to what we've been talking about. So if I smoothly glide over here, this is a demo account for a fictitious company called Foodco. Imagine this is kind of enterprise level CPG company, and they have done some initial product footprinting across all of the products in their portfolio, so that they can start to get a summary page where they can understand which products are the biggest emissions drivers, which categories are the biggest emissions drivers, and get to a product carbon footprint value per SKU across their portfolio. So here, this is just a demo account. We have 23 products, but this can scale across typically thousands of SKUs, where we can get an indication of the product carbon footprint, and also take into account the production volume of each SKU. So when we're making decisions, we're not just looking at a SKU in isolation, we're also thinking about the volume of that SKU that is being produced, and therefore what is the overall impact of that product based on production volume as well. If I open up one of these products, let's say high emissions driving product is a milk latte, then we get an overview of the elements that make up the product carbon footprint. So here we see the breakdown of the materials contributing 95% of emissions in this case, not atypical to see in the kind of food and ag industry, and then the other elements making up that PCF. And what we're really looking at here, which is of interest, is within this product carbon footprint, we can now see that some of our highest emitting drivers to the emissions come from our coffee input and our milk input. So if we're thinking about where we may want to substitute out a secondary emissions factor, which is initially being used to calculate this PCF, and replace that with primary data, we can now see that it would be collecting emissions factors, or PCFs, from these suppliers for these inputs. And if I then just head over to our supplier engagement part of the platform, you can now, let's say, search for a dairy supplier, saying maybe you've made a decision based on this that you really want to kind of prioritize getting some better primary data from your milk and dairy-based suppliers. You can then open up your supplier area, look at all of the purchases that you've made from that supplier, and then start this outreach process where you can request the PCF from the supplier, and they would receive then an invitation to provide that data. If they haven't already, they can directly send it either through the pack data exchange mechanism or a survey. If a key supplier has not has not calculated their PCF yet, then we also have a solution where kind of a simplified version of calculating product footprints can be used to support suppliers in that journey. Cool. What's the stop tour of the platform? We'll now head to our word cloud, which is the response to the question, what is the biggest challenge you face developing product carbon footprints? So here we have how to develop one, not sure, compliance, creating the data, cost, specificity, best route to establish and missing recipes primary.
Yeah, Caroline, how about you and I each alternate and we try and cover these? So I can pick one and then you pick one and we can work our way through. And then let's also maybe just kick off the Q&A in the meantime. So while Caroline and I are on that, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We already have one shared anonymously. Conscious we have only 6 or 7 minutes, so we'll try and race through. Let me maybe start with the cost side. So if you look at, let's say, a full LCA or life cycle analysis as the existing benchmark for similar sort of data, LCA costs are notoriously variable. And so if you look at what the higher end of the cost spectrum, I've heard of LCAs costing $30,000-$40,000 for one, and I've heard of LCAs costing $3,000 or $4,000 for one, and it can be an exercise of a few months. What we're finding is that with product carbon footprints, there is a cost associated, but the cost is radically lower than what you're seeing with LCAs, and the cost goes down with scale as well. And so for a large company with tens of thousands of product carbon footprints, at scale, as technology evolves, we see no reason why you couldn't have an individual product carbon footprint costing somewhere between $10 and $100, for example, for an individual product carbon footprint. And that's, we think, the level at which this cost needs to come for it to be a widespread tool across the value chain. It's unlikely that the cost goes down to zero anytime in the near future, because you still have cloud computing requirements and some manual oversight in some cases of some of the data associated. Caroline, over to you.
I think a nice pick up from that is how to develop one, which sort of goes hand in hand in cost, because the answer to how to develop one previously was to enlist the help of an LCA specialist, and they would product by product look at the product, apply a method, like the best method for that product to that, and work through collecting the data for that product, kind of activity by activity, but for product level. When we look at what goes into a product carbon footprint, then there are themes of areas that are going to be consistent across every single product. So we can break this down into what are the packaging elements that go into your product, what are the material inputs that go into the product, what is the logistics that's associated with moving the product and the inputs of that product around, what's the emissions coming from the electricity, heating, for example, in the facility where the product was produced. And these are your kind of common building blocks of any PCF. So if we think about those, then we can start to collect those data elements in a structured way at scale, which then is this kind of bridge from I need to do this one by one with one person looking at this to, hey, this is the kind of structured data set I need to have a representative PCF. And then I can kind of look to bring that data in bulk, which, yeah, kind of answers the question of one, how to develop it, and then two, kind of goes hand in hand with how we can start getting the cost of doing this down to a sensible level.
Caroline, let me try and take the best route to establish, and I'll also try and cover the missing primary recipes information as well. And then I don't know if you want to take compliance and specificity, for example, and then we can kind of switch over to a couple of the questions we have in chat.
Yeah, great.
On the best route to establish, I think it's worth being transparent that generating product carbon footprints at scale is a heavier lift capability than generating a carbon baseline. And that's typically because it has a couple of elements of work that you wouldn't normally have with a carbon baseline. One is that the bill of materials or recipes, for example, whatever you want to call it, becomes much more important. You need to know what goes into the product so that you can appropriately attribute things that you're buying, things that you're doing to an individual product. And so that becomes a higher lift, basically, versus what you'd be doing in the carbon baselining world. So if you're working with a software partner like Altruistic, for example, or a consulting partner, you'd need to be able to provide that sort of data, which means you need to have that level of confidence in the data security and information security available in the solution partner that you're working with. Another element is you might have, in most large organizations, have multiple facilities producing the same product and even the same stock keeping unit. And so if you want to be able to have a PCF snapshot at the level of a certain facility, which means you want to know what this product looked like when made in facility A versus facility B, then you also need to be able to map those individual facilities, whether it's in the platform environment like Altruistic, for example, or otherwise. You need to be able to map that as well to the products. And so there are these couple of additional lifts involved. Having said that, what we're finding is that we're working with companies at scale on product carbon footprint capabilities. And so it is doable, it is being done, it is happening. And the best route to establish it is to find a partner that you trust. And assuming that you have the use case for it, which means it's not a vanity project, it's something that's necessary in the business and worth the lift for the business in terms of getting the right data in, it is straightforward to get done. In terms of the missing recipe or primary data, it will be very difficult for you to have any form of credible product carbon footprint without knowing what goes into the product. So you will need your bill of materials, you will need your recipe equivalent. And so that puts all the more weight on the business case for doing this. If this is important enough to be done, then it is important enough for your team and you to have access to that information in case there's an access restriction. And the reason why it might be important enough is because you're a B2B business and your customers are asking for it and making it a rite of passage to doing business with them or to getting a higher volume with them. Or you're a B2C business and this is an important part of your brand identity, or there's a regulatory imperative as there is for most large consumer-facing companies, certainly. Caroline, over to you.
Yeah, taking compliance, I'm wondering whether this is lack of awareness about what compliance is required in the product carbon footprinting space or otherwise, but I'm gonna take that tact and hope that's right. So it's not mandatory yet. There's no legislation or regulation again yet around creating product carbon footprints. I think it will be coming at some point, but for the reasons that I spoke about earlier with this kind of numerous different standards and methodologies that exist for calculating this data, then there's no kind of clear guidance. I think the closest that could be coming is the European PEF guidance, but this has kind of been stuck in discussions and conversations about how to set this up for a while. So potentially some labeling standard and kind of regulation around that coming at some point. We see that a little bit further ahead in the fashion space, but not there yet for food and beverage. So I think the real impetus now is to get ahead, be aware that this will likely come at some point, But the drivers right now are for you to be able to understand your data to make kind of decarbonisation decisions and to be able to communicate outwards to customers and consumers with confidence there.
Caroline, should we do the same for the questions in the chat? So I can do the first one around other impact categories, and then why don't you take the second one, and maybe we tag team on the third, or we cover them in turn. In terms of leaving aside other impact categories, I would say treat a product carbon footprint capability as an additional rather than an or. And so for situations where you want an LCA or you need an LCA, you need to understand the other environmental impacts at play, an LCA is still likely going to be the best bet for you. There will be many companies where one ingredient is important enough, maybe one ingredient sourced from one geography, like cocoa from Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, for example, is important enough where a life cycle assessment or analysis is super important. In which case, that's just an and. A product carbon footprint capability is for you to have another tool in the toolbox to be able to drive decarbonization at scale. That said, we do think that this is foundational infrastructure that will be deployed to other impact categories as well. And so carbon is just easier to deal with to start with because the methodologies are much better understood. It's much more ubiquitous. But we do expect that the same infrastructure and playbook and toolkit and software and technology will be deployable across other impact categories as well. And so carbon is just almost like carbon is the pilot version of this. Caroline, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah, I'll pick up Kirsten's question here, which is, in your supplier engagement outreach, are you facilitating evaluation of the accuracy of the primary EF provided by the suppliers? And the answer there is yes. Like we feel that having this view on the accuracy and trustworthiness of the data coming in is really key to being able to use it. We look at the kind of temporal representativeness. So you might have requested an EF from a supplier for your 2024 footprints yourself, but you receive a product carbon footprint from the supplier that was calculated in 2021 or 2022. Now that's still something to work with. It's better than nothing, but that would take a hit on kind of data quality by not being fully up to speed. Likewise, we can look at the kind of technological representativeness of the data that's coming in and the geographical representative of the data that's being used as well. All of these are incorporated into the PACT method and standard. So if we are aligning around the PACT data model, then these data quality components are kind of structured and harmonized there. And yeah, if we are collecting data through our own supplier survey as well, if someone exchanging PCFs is not yet set up with PACT, then all of those data quality fields are also listed. It might also be interesting to know, I think this is a key area that we know PACT are looking to kind of develop and mature, is one of the things that we're sort of collaborating with them on and working with them on to how do we make sure that we collect these data quality indicators in a lightweight way, but that are really instructive and useful once received.
Thanks, Caroline. And let me take Leah's question as the last one, and then we can draw this to a conclusion. Leah, we are seeing multiple examples of how companies are using PCFs to prioritize or influence their operational decarbonization strategy. Let me give three. One is that using Altruistic, for example, you can take a PCF snapshot of an individual product as made at a particular point in time at a particular facility, which means that you can see how that changes over points in time. It's like a photograph of the product at a point in time at a particular location with certain suppliers used. So if you change up anything about the manufacturing process, the bill of materials, the suppliers, the energy being used at that facility, and 6 months later you take a fresh photograph or snapshot, you can actually compare those side by side and see how they've changed, which means that you get a real like-for-like comparison, and you can isolate what has actually moved the needle in that comparison as well. So that's one powerful tool. The second is we actually now have product-level modeling, so you can actually say, hey, if I have let's say, making this up, I have like an Oreo cookie, for example, and I want to see how the packaging being changed in this particular stock keeping unit for the Oreo cookie affects the emissions footprint of the Oreo cookie, you can actually model that out at the level of an individual SKU or an individual product. And you can do that for as many products as you like, really. So if you think of a brand team or a sustainability team oriented towards a particular brand or a particular product line, you can actually start modeling this really in the context of your individual products, using the live streams of data from the suppliers supplying those products and the manufacturing processes going into those products, and you can start experimenting with swaps. A third use case is you can have product carbon footprints acquired from suppliers in a comparable way, and you can actually compare them for the same ingredient bought from different suppliers, and that can inform the decisions that your procurement team might make to channel more volume towards supplier A versus supplier B, for example. So those are just a few examples. Obviously, I'm very happy to have a broader conversation around this if there are any specific questions you have as a deep dive. Want to just echo Izzy in the chat, so please feel free to add any other questions and we can follow up async. Conscious that those of you still with us have stayed on several minutes long, so want to draw this to a conclusion here. But please do visit the link Izzy has put in the chat, or just scan the QR code here, and you'll be able to sort of follow our content on an ongoing basis and also share any other questions with us. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Caroline, for being my co-presenter and getting at least 7 out of 10 of my cues right in the first half, and then taking on splendidly in the rest of it. And excited to reconnect with many of our listeners in subsequent conversations. Thank you.